Okay, hello, 13 July, weekly marks. In preparation for what hopes to be the lecture series by Andy Higginbottom on Capital Volume 3, thought I would provide introductions to the third volume Capital. I don't do it. The theory. Perhaps more coherently in this version. This is from a text on a culmination of capital essays on volume 3 of Marx's Capital, edited by Martha Campbell and Geert Rutten. And this is from the introduction, or the introduction, Marx's Capital 3, the culmination of Capital General Introduction by Geert Rutten. This introductory chapter starts with a brief discussion of why writing about Marx's Capital 3 is not only interpretive, this is true for any work, but is also bound to be reconstructive. The first section outlines a general overview of Capital 3's 7 parts in light of the earlier 2 volumes. Finally, the essays in this book are introduced. This is the introduction to a collection of essays. Finally, the essays in this book are introduced. Number 1, the shapes of the whole process, interpretation and reconstruction. The first volume of Karl Marx's life work, Das Kapital, was published in 1867. When Marx died in 1883 at the age of 64, he left volumes 2 and 3 as unfinished manuscripts, which range anywhere from mere notes or outlines to text, all but ready for publication. The manuscript for volume 3 is a single draft, and relative to the other volumes, an early one, having been written between the summer of 1864 and December 1865. It was not until 30 years later in 1897 that the third volume was published in German. Like the second, published in 1885, it was edited by Friedrich Engels. 1 year after the 1894 publication, Engels himself died at the age of 75. These few bibliobiographical facts are relevant to the interpretation of Capital, since for Marx, architectonic and Darstellung presentation are an essential stage of scientific work. Almost certainly, if Marx had lived long enough to publish volumes 2 and 3 himself, they would have been quite different from the works we now have. Most likely, also, their difference would have led in turn to another revision of volume 1, which Marx had already changed between the first edition and the second edition of 1873. The reading of any text, complete or incomplete, of course, involves interpretation behind the author's back, so to speak. There are, however, 3 particular reasons to be extra cautious in the case of Marx's work. First, as Engels says of his editing in his preface to Capital 3, I confined this simply to what was most necessary, and whatever clarity permitted, I retained the character of the original draft, not even deleting certain repetitions where these grasped the subject matter from a different angle or expressed it in another way, as was Marx's custom. Such repetitions appear not only in volume 3 of Capital, but in the earlier volumes as well. Apart from those related to the draft character of the text, they are due to aspects of Marx's method. In particular, he emphasizes throughout the double character of entities in capitalism, that is, material shape and capitalist value form, and the related differentiation between general, that is, transhistorical, and determinate capitalist categories. Further, As Marx's presentation proceeds, it discloses new features of the entities under consideration, so that these are continually reconstructed. So that these are continually reconceptualized and redefined, so to say. Apart from such aspects of method, however, Marx often obviously struggles with the materials at hand, either to find the most appropriate way of presenting it, or indeed to present it from different angles, because there is more than one appropriate aspect. Second, and related to the first point, in the view of all the contributors to this book at least, Marx makes a fundamental break with the political economy and philosophy of his time. Without implying that all my co-authors share this view, I also hold that the initiator of a break can never realize it completely. Because initiators are brought up in the tradition from which they break, their work is shaped by the central concerns of that tradition. And they must, to a considerable extent, speak in its language. Especially in the case of Capital 3, these central concerns arise in large part from Ricardo's theory. It is left to the heirs, setting out from different questions, to unfold all that the break entails, or retreat from it. Hence, interpreting the work of the initiator of a break is bound to be an unfolding or a retreating reconstruction. It follows also that there may not be full consistency in the initiator's work. As regards interpretation, then, it is generally easier to see a particular interpretation confirmed by the text than to see it not falsified. In view of the foregoing, the contributors to this book adopt different stances towards the interpretation of Marx. At one end, Tony Smith, that is chapter 7, holds that any interpretation of Marx's text is always a reconstruction. At the other, in Fred Mosley's view, chapter 4, Marx's aims are clear enough to allow for an interpretation close to the intention of the author. Others see a need for reconstruction for several reasons, because of defects in or of acknowledged concurrent theoretical lines in Marx's writing. The presence of different lines is not by itself a problem, and because certain abstract treatments by Marx require further mediation and concretion. The third reason to be extra cautious in the interpretation of Marx's work, particularly Capital 3, is more straightforward. The text is clearly influenced by Engels' editing. This should not be read as a criticism of Engels. It is only because of his dedication that volumes 2 and 3 were published at all. As already noted, Capital 3 was published in 1894, 11 years after Marx's death, and 9 years after the publication of Volume 2. In its preface, Engels explains, and I've included that why there was such a delay. Political activities, other theoretical work, his health, but the main reason appears to have been the state of Marx's draft for Volume 3. Given the state of the manuscript, Engels could never have been successful in all respects. For example, one might complain he should have taken out repetitious parts, which would have implied a choice of emphasis. Should not have included, obviously, were just notes which might have concealed the intended architectonic, or that he should have been more specific in indicating his own alternatives and interpolations, which might have marred the continuity of the text. In any case, it must be recognized that Engels left his mark on the text. In his preface, Engels writes, "Whatever my alterations or additions are not simply editorial in character. I have put the entire passage in pointed brackets and indicated it with my initials." We may grant that this was Engels' intention, but dispute his claim to have observed the limits that he set. By way of illustration, attention is drawn here to just one point, the subtitle of Volume 3. It is notorious that for the English edition of Volume 1, Engels changed Marx's subtitle from "The Production Process of Capital" to "The Process of Capital." capitalist production. These are, of course, quite different issues. That is, the production process of capital is not the same as the process of capitalist production. These are, of course, quite different issues. In line with his revision of the subtitle of Volume 1, Engels imposed on Volume 3 the subtitle, The Process of Capitalist Production as a Whole. Marx's own title in his draft of Volume 3 is different. It is The Shapes of the Whole Process. Now, Marx says in his introduction that this meant the unity of the first two books. Engels gives credence to his subtitle by inserting unmarked the first three sentences of the opening chapter of Volume 3. This collection of studies is based on Marx's Capital 3 as edited by Engels. The authors do not take the view that the real text, whatever real may mean in this context, is that of Marx's manuscripts. The manuscripts of 1864 to 65, for example, is a work on its own, as are those of 1857 to 58 and 1861 to 63, and they should be the subject of a study of their own. Nevertheless, although the Capital 3 text is our platform, some of us from that platform further develop Marxian theory in reference to later, for example, 20th century works, while others, for their purposes, refer back to earlier work of Marx, including the published manuscripts just mentioned. Capital 3 in light of the first two volumes. Levels of abstraction. Descriptions of the interconnection of the three volumes of Capital and, relatedly, of Marx's general method are bound to be reconstructive as well as controversial. Among the authors of this book, at least, there is agreement about three interdependent aspects of Marx's method. First, the dialectic is not unnecessary jargon that could be dispensed with, but key to the understanding of capital. Nevertheless, views differ as to differences between the systematic dialectics of Hegel and Marx. Second, all authors agree that the movement in Capital is from abstract and simple categories to concrete and complex ones, and is marked by conceptual levels of abstraction or concretion. Nevertheless, there are different views about what this implies, especially about whether and how the later, more concrete levels modify the earlier and more abstract ones. Third, all agree that these levels are marked by the parts within each of the volumes of Capital, many of which are also conceptual conversions or transformations. Nevertheless, views may differ as to whether these can be defined into each other as in a linear or formal logic, allowing perhaps also for quantitative translations between levels. In addition, all the authors emphasize, although with different accentuations, that the monetary value form is key to the understanding of capital. These general agreements, it should be noted, differentiate the current work from what may be considered its complement. That is, the collection of papers edited by Bellafiore, 1998. Now, 2.2, from Capital 1 and 2 to Capital 3. Marx's Capital is an exposition of the logic of capital, its production and reproduction. The work describes the object of inquiry from within, developing the object's own standards and processes to its logical conclusions, and thus assessing the object internally. In Capital 1, Capital Volume 1, after having established the capitalist social form, that is, the value form and its expression in money and capital itself, capital's need for labor for the production of value and surplus value is developed in extenso. Capital's need can therefore be fulfilled because of its social dominance over labor. Dominance, since capital, is also the social materialization of property in the means of production. For this reason, capital can impose its form on society. Therefore, also, we have the social production of capital. The German subtitle of Volume 1 brings out this double meaning very well. Der Produktionsbrust de Kapitals, where des means both the process of production of and by capital. For example, need and dominance. Having established this in Volume 1, capital can move on, so to say, to its own workings in Volume 2 and 3, jargon, its own business. Labor moves to the background. It literally scarcely makes an appearance, except for a few instances, such as in the circuit of capital, where labor occurs as only a formal element, Volume 2, Part 1, or the social reproduction of capital, where labor appears merely in its function of buying part of the consumer goods produced, Volume 2, Part 3. Consequently, whenever Marx discusses aspects of crisis and the cycle of production in Capital 2 and 3, it is no longer in terms of a shortage or abundance of labor as in Volume 1. Rather, it is from the standpoint of the dominance of capital, in terms of its movement from slack to overproduction, predicated on the movement of production of surplus value in relation to capital investment. Volume 2, Part 3, Volume 3, Part 3, or even more sublimated in terms of the shortage or abundance of money capital, seemingly disconnected from production, Volume 3, Part 5. The 7 parts of Capital 3. The first 3 parts of Capital 3, 15 chapters in all, are on aspects of the rate of profit of capital in general. From the concept of surplus value and the rate of surplus value treated at length in the first volume, Marx develops in Part 1 the core concepts of profit and the rate of profit. They are effects or results of the whole process at any point in time, and as such, the concentration of many determinants, but simultaneously, they are decisive or causative for the reproduction of capital. They are capital's continuity measures. The rate of profit is the motive power of capitalist production, and nothing is produced save what can be produced at a profit. Part 2 shows one side of the dynamics of this continuity, that is, how the competition between capitals for the highest rate of profit results in an averaging out of the rate of profit. The flow of capital from branches producing at relatively lower profit rates, or profit rate, to branches producing at a higher, thus results tendentially in the establishment of a general rate of profit, which, as before, is both effect and cause. Along the way, it is shown how the concept of price, as developed in Volume 1, gets modified. Thus, we see first how the oneness of the capitalist social form, that is, the oneness or one-dimensionality of the value form as expressed in prices, established in Volume 1, brings forth a common measure or scale for capitalist success. That is, the rate of profit, which is money over money. Next, we see how this measure, generalizing prices into prices of production, that is, prices formed in terms of the rate of profit, tendentially brings forth a common quantity on this scale. Whereas Part 2 sets out, so to speak, the synchronic dynamics of capitalist continuity, although this is a synchronic process in time. Part 3 presents the diachronic dynamics of continuity, that is, the development of the general rate of profit itself. Thus, within the synchronic tendency to the formation of a general rule of general rate of profit, that rate itself changes diachronically. And again, we have a further determining moment of the production of surplus value. This diachronic dynamics, unfolding over time, is the culmination of Marx's architectonic of capital in general. Its basis is the profit-enforced introduction of cost-reducing techniques of production, which are reflected in a rising organic composition of capital and which generate rate of profit increases to the initiating capital, but simultaneously operate as a drain on the average rate of profit. With this capital goes through treadmill-like cyclical movements in which valorization of capital gets expressed in devalorization and accumulation of capital in devaluation. Up to this point, capital was presented as an organic unity. Number one, of capitals in synchronic concurrence, that is competition for profit, part one. Number two, synchronically establishing their general rate of profit, part two. This has been based on reading backwards through capital, the presentation of capital, part number three. Come on. As synchronically connected, the presentation of capital, three, as synchronically connected in its material constituents, that is, the means of production and means of consumption, both in their material, character, and S values, Department 1 and 2, Volume 2, Part 3. 4, as synchronizing its diachronic movement so as to trim the time that capital is tied up in the phases of its circuit, Volume 2, Part 2. Number 5, diachronically moving through the stages by which it is posited and reposited as capital, from the money form of capital M, to its commodity form, capital C, to its valorizing productive form, P, an ideally valorized new commodity form, C prime, and back to the valorized money form, M prime. That is, in this path, M to C, P, C prime dash M prime, or from any other point of departure constituting the circuit of capital, Volume 2, Part 1. 6. Nevertheless, capital is an organic unity that has only apparent self-subsistence. To be more than a formal organic unity, it needs the other of and for itself, that is, the subsumption of labor as its valorizing foundation, so as to exist and generate fruit, Volume 1. At the level of capital in general, all this culminates in the forces raising the value productivity of labor by revolutionizing the technical constituents of the labor process. The concomitant accelerating valorization for the revolutionizing echelons of capital goes along with devalorization and devaluation of capital as a whole, giving rise to crises and cycles in accumulation. Part 3. Even if capitals are invested in different branches of production and competing, they are all alike up to this point in Marx's presentation, in that they go through the same process of valorization and its cycle. In parts 4 to 6, this unity seems to fall apart. Capital in general separates into functionally different factions of capital. In part 4, capital divides into industrial capital, commercial capital, and money dealing capital. Though functionally different, they're all still alike in that they all equally share tendentially in the one for all general rate of profit. Note also that in hindsight, this division is implicit in the synchronizing diachronic of the second part of Capital, Volume 2. The rigorous split seems to occur in Part 5 when Marx, via a number of intermediate steps, developed what is now called finance capital. This he initially counterposes to the management of functioning capital. At this stage of the analysis, these factions are in conflict, and it is their relative power as well as the stage of the cycle that decides their shares in the general rate of profit. With Marx's presentation of share capital, however, the counterposition seems to supersede into the dominance of finance capital. Thus, we see capital actually developed into, M develops into M plus delta M. This is, M becoming M prime. as money breeding money into this irrational form, as Marx calls it, which is anticipated early in Volume 1. In interest-bearing capital, which is capital in its most fetishistic form, we see another accumulation of capital and of capital, the book. It is in interest-bearing capital, which is capital in its most fetishistic form, we see another accumulation of capital and of big C capital. It is reinforced by another accumulation that is unfolded along with it. The development of money into credit money, which also hints back to the starting point of capital. Capital develops into itself, but see the previous note. One might wonder, qua presentation equally underdeveloped, Part 6 on land and ground rent should add to this. From one point of view, Marx merely treats an important phenomenal shape of his time. There are, however, two other reasons, not particularly emphasized by Marx, why this part deserves to be placed at the very end. The first reason is in line with the general argument of capital. Even nature must take on the form of value, and insofar as it can be appropriated, it can be capitalized. The even needs qualification, of course, as already even labor power and its labor have taken on the form of value. The second reason apparently tempers the conclusion of the previous part of capital developing into itself. Capital can mold nature and labor, but it is ultimately limited by them. Capital cannot reproduce land or nature. Marx does not emphasize this particular point explicitly, but uses it to develop the category of monopoly and monopoly profits generally. The category of monopoly may be seen as positing capital's mirror for the capital form of the monopoly over the means of production generally. Now, the last part, Part 7, consists of 5 relatively short and diverse chapters that cap off Volume 3's presentation of the shapes of capital and of its valorization. That is, interest, profit of enterprise, and rent. In addition, they emphasize Marx's fundamental point that capitalism is a historically specific and mutable mode of production that conceals its class structure. These chapters might be considered as outlines for setting out the concrete manifestations of the whole. Number 3, Introduction to the Essays. The next chapter, written by Paul Maddock, takes as its starting point Capital Volume 3's incomplete final chapter 52 on classes. He reviews the development of the argument over the course of the 3 volumes, arguing that capital abstracts from occupational groupings and income levels to focus attention on the distinction between the producers and appropriators of surplus value. This distinction takes on central social importance in periods of economic crisis, when the insufficiency of surplus value extracted from the working class disrupts the normal functioning of the social system. At such times, Marx thought, capitalism itself might be called into question. Capital, Maddock argues, is ultimately a study of the conditions of this possibility. Its theory of class points to the eventual abolition of class distinctions. From a very different perspective, Chapter 3 by Chris Arthur, also covers the 3 volumes of Capital as a whole. Basing himself on Marx's 1857 to 58 outline for Capital, the Grundrisse, he sets out an entirely new view of the overall structure of the work. Contrasting capital in general with capital in its particularity and capital in its singularity, he shows how that schema as a 3x3 matrix maps both within and across the 3 volumes. Along with this, he also provides a novel conceptualization of the apparently heterogeneous contents of Volume 3. In Chapter 4 of this book, Fred Mosley argues that the main subject of Capital Volume 3, Capital 3, is the distribution of surplus value. going through all the parts of the work, he indicates that via the equalization of rates of profit across branches, surplus value is divided into industrial profit, commercial profit, interest, and rent. Mosley argues further that the production of surplus value is unaffected by the distributive processes set out in Volume 3. Thus, these processes are based on the premise that the total amount of surplus value has been fully determined at the level of analysis of Volume 1. This means that the individual parts of surplus value being explained in Volume 3 are necessary forms of appearance of the common substance that is surplus labor. Ricardo Bellafiore's Chapter 5 deals with the transformation problem in Part 2 of Capital, Volume 3. He offers an alternative to the new interpretation of Dumenil and Foley, shifting the focus to the labor theory of value as an explanation of the origin of the capitalist surplus instead of an explanation of money prices. The problems of Marx's original presentation, Bellafiore maintains, arise from his theory of commodity money. He argues for a reconstruction of Marx's theory along the lines of a monetary theory of production, involving a credit theory of money, where money enters circulation as banks' initial finance, and a credit theory of exploitation, where money capital gives firms command over the whole of abstract labor and over the division of the social working day in production. In Chapter 6, Christopher Arthur takes on the same Part 2 and its chapter on the formation of a general rate of profit. In it, two discourses are at play, one which takes this rate to be determined systemically, and one which takes it as a reference point for capital migration. Their reconciliation is achieved by arguing that capital is a totality and yet necessarily composed of many capitals subject to forces of repulsion and attraction, as Marx terms them. The transformation problem arises because the general concept of capital is particularized both formally and materially. While this results in particular real capitals, the general form also has separate real existence in banking. There arises a general rate of profit attributable to capital considered as an individual totality. As we've indicated, the development of Marx's theory in capital consists of a systematic ordering from relatively simple and abstract categories to determinations that are progressively more complex and concrete. In Chapter 7, Tony Smith argues that for much of the 3 volumes this ordering proceeds simultaneously along 2 dimensions, one devoted to the reproduction of total social capital in any given period, the other to the dynamism of capital from one period to the next. These 2 dimensions come together in Volume 3 in a manner that requires us to introduce a distinct theoretical level in Marx's theory, that is, surplus profits due to innovation. From a logical standpoint, this level falls prior to the parts of Volume 3 investigating overaccumulation crises and financial crises. Part 3 through 5 of Capital Volume 3 are discussed in Geert Ruten's Chapter 8. On the basis of the text of Marx's manuscript, he argues that Part 3 presents a theory of the rate of profit cycle. Its name, that is, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, is therefore rather misleading. In a review of Parts 4 and 5, it is argued that Marx finally arrives at the view that finance capital is dominant. It is shown that this view neglects the independent role of managerial capital. A potential conflict between managerial and finance capital modifies the way the profit rate cycle gets expressed, namely in the devaluation and revaluation of capital, and consequently the course of the cycle. Chapter 9 by Martha Campbell deals with another aspect of Part 5, that is, the credit system. With it, Marx introduces credit money, presenting it as the form of money capital creates. That's the form of money capital creates, hence as money's modern and adequate form. By contrast, precious metal money, to which Marx appeals in Volume 1, is the form of money that capital encounters on its historical emergence. The turn from the one to the other is an intentional revision, typical of Marx's method. Questions arise, however, because of Marx's insistence that credit money retains its linkage to gold. This suggests that, having developed the credit system, Marx collapses money back into its primitive form. Now, rejecting this interpretation, it's argued that Marx refers to gold to make the point that institutional design of the credit system does not subjugate capital to intentional social control. Marx's theory of rent, part 6 of Capital 3, is considered in chapter 10 by Martha Campbell. Opposing Ricardo, Marx argues that rent is determined by the interaction between capitalist production and the private ownership of an element of production that capital cannot produce. In support of this thesis, Marx identifies the conflicts inherent in the lease relationship. Further, he defines fertility as the relation between production techniques and the characteristics of land, and extends his theory of technological innovation to agriculture. Although the quantitative dimension of the theory of absolute rent is flawed, it is argued that this can be detached from Marx's main point, which is that ownership necessarily confers economic power. The last chapter, chapter 11 by Patrick Murray, takes us back to the seventh and final part of Marx's work, especially its chapter on the Trinity formula. Key to capital is the idea that there is no production, no wealth, no need in general. They always have a definite social form involving specific social purposes. The idea that there can be production in general is what Murray terms the illusion of the economic. He argues that capital is made up of two movements of thought. The first centers on the fetishism of the product, the second on the fetishism of the factors involved in the labor process in capitalism. The Trinity chapter concludes this second movement. It dispels the illusion of treating the capitalist mode of production as if it were production in general, lacking a specific form and purpose, and as if its specific social forms, that is, wages, interest, and rent, were general natural forms. Consequently, it concludes Marx's theory of value, so also revealing its profound distance from the classical labor theory of value, as well as from any notion of isolating the wealth added by this or that factor, for the simple reason that there is no common measure of use value. Now, that may not seem horribly clear, but it is a introduction to the text. And with bibliography. Now, what I've included here is a second example. It's an article that appears in the Marxist Internet archives, and that is Michael Heinrich's article from 1996 to 97, 1996 to 1997, volume 60, number 4 in Science and Society. And that is Engels' edition of the third volume of Capital and Marx's original manuscript. Now, it does rehearse what we've just talked about as a matter of introduction to talking about volume 3. And here's the abstract. There will be a little redundancy in here because he comes to similar conclusions, let's put it that way. Abstract. In 1993, Marx's manuscript of 1864, used by Engels as the basis for volume 3 of Capital, became available as part of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. It is therefore now possible to compare the original manuscript with the version published by Engels. This comparison reveals that Engels made significant modifications despite his own claim to have restricted his role to one of faithfully presenting Marx's own work. Changes to Marx's text include design of headings, insertion of subheadings, and textual transpositions, omissions, and insertions. The changes have real impacts on the text, especially in the area of prices theory, the theory of credit, and the relationship between capitalism and commodity production. Marx's thinking was far more ambivalent and much less developed than it appears to be on the basis of Engels' editing, and it is doubtful whether the materials were available to complete Capital. In any case, future study of Marx's thought must turn to the MEGA manuscripts rather than to Engels' Volume 3. Now, this may sound like delimiting Engels' text, and I think that you sort of need to know why Engels did it, which is why I've included the preface and these two introductions to Volume 3. In 1894, Engels published the third volume of Capital out of Marx's literary bequest. 27 years after the first volume's first publication, Marx's main oeuvre was complete, at least as far as its theoretical part was concerned, since Marx had planned a fourth theory historical volume in the 1860s. The third volume, Volume 3, has caused heavy controversies concerning Marx's economic theory ever since it was published. The problem of transformation of values into production prices, the decline of the rate of profit, crisis theory, the analysis of the credit system. All these questions refer to parts of the third volume of Capital. Soon the question was raised as to how strongly Engels intervened into Marx's text during the editing of the manuscript. The manuscript of 1864 to 65, which Engels mainly used for the publication, was first published in 1992 in the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA, so that for the first time in 100 years, two questions can be examined. Question number one, to what extent and with what implications for content did Engels intervene into Marx's original manuscript during editing? And number two, how far did Marx actually get with the elaboration of the third volume of Capital? Section 1, extant knowledge of Engels' editing. 2 years after Marx's death, Engels had already published the second volume of Capital from Marx's estate. In the preface to this volume, he wrote about Volume 3, which was still to be published. This is Engels. The preparation of this book for publication is proceeding rapidly. So far, as I am able to judge up till now, it will present mainly technical difficulties with the exception of a few but important sections. Despite the expectations due to this statement that Volume 3 would be published as fast as Volume 2, it was to take 9 more years until it was finally finished. In the meantime, Engels had repeatedly announced the publication, mainly in letters. In view of the long period until the date of publication, and even considering Engels' other obligations, it can be presumed that the publication of the manuscript caused him great effort, and the question is, into what task was this effort invested? In the preface to the finally published volume, Engels reported on his editing activity. He characterized Marx's manuscript as an extremely incomplete first draft. The beginnings of the various parts were, as a rule, pretty carefully done and even stylistically polished, but the further one went, the more sketchy and incomplete was the manuscript, the more excursions it contained into arising side issues whose proper place in the argument was left for later decision. And the longer and more complex the sentences in which thoughts were recorded in slatu nascendi. On his own editing of Marx's text, Engels wrote, I limited this to the essential. I tried my best to preserve the character of the first draft wherever it was sufficiently clear, wherever my alterations or additions exceeded the bounds of editing, or where I had to apply Marx's factual material to independent conclusions of my own, if even as faithful as possible to the spirit of Marx. I have enclosed the entire passage in brackets and affixed my initials. Well, he didn't quite do that, and that's Heinrich takes Engels to task. The statement suggests that Marx Engels marked all his textual interventions, except for the ones not exceeding the bounds of editing, as such. But in the following characterization of the individual paragraphs, he lists a large number of transpositions, additions, contractions, and similar alterations, which he especially made in Part 5, whereby he even dissolved a whole chapter and distributed its contents. But he thereby succeeded in working into the text all the author's relevant statements. Here, he also says, this could not, of course, be done without considerable interpolation on my part for the sake of continuity. Unless they're merely formal in nature, the interpolations are expressly indicated as belonging to me. This statement unmistakably says that Engels by no means indicated all the interpolations and alterations he made. The preface offers no clue regarding the extent of these alterations. It is to be assumed, however, that they were by no means minor. The supplement to Capital written by Engels also indicates considerable changes. In the supplement to Capital, Engels wrote that he had tried to eliminate difficulties in understanding and to bring more to the fore important aspects whose significance is not strikingly enough evident in the text. Thus, Engels himself wanted to transmit what was important to the readers by correcting the original. A letter to Danielson on July 4th, 1889 also shows the extent of the manipulations undertaken. Engels wrote, but since this final volume is such a great and completely incontestable work, I consider it to be my duty to publish it in a form which clearly shows the overall line of argumentation clearly and plastically. This is not quite so easy due to the state of this manuscript, a first often interrupted and incomplete sketch. On the whole, Marx's own characterization, or Engels' own characterization of his editing activity are contradictory. On the one hand, he claims to have only made minor alterations, that he wanted to keep the text in Marx's own words as far as possible, and that he didn't want to eliminate the text's draft character. His editing indeed shows that this third volume was by no means finished. Careful editing of Marx's manuscript can, therefore, be expected. On the other hand, however, there is evidence that Engels must have made a large number of textual modifications that are not indicated to the readers to clarify the overall line of argumentation or what Engels presumed as such. Therefore, Engels cannot have exercised as much restraint in editing as he claimed. This contradictory characterization of his editorial treatment of Marx's text is obviously an expression of his own contradictory intentions. On the one hand, he wanted to preserve the unfinished character of Marx's manuscript and present an authentic text to the readers. On the other hand, however, he wanted to make the text more understandable, especially in view of the book's political importance. The most important points were to be evident not by a commentary, but in the edition itself. These two objectives, however, exclude each other. Section number 2, an overview of Engels' textual modifications. This gets really in the weeds. The comparison of the original manuscript with Engels' edition, which has only just become possible, shows that there are modifications to the original text on practically each page that have not been indicated. Hardly one paragraph remained as Marx had written it. Engels' modifications are not confined to stylistic matters. They can be classified as follows. A, design of titles and headings, the structure of the manuscript. Even the title of the manuscript was altered by Engels. Engels turned Gestaltungen des Gesamtprozesses, that is, formations of the process as a whole, into der Gesamtprozess der kapitalistischen Produktion, the process of capitalist production as a whole. Thus, an analogy to the titles of volumes 1 and 2 and is created, but at the same time, a certain vagueness connected to Marx's title is eliminated. Additionally, the question is whether the title should, if seeking connection to the earlier titles, mention reproduction and not production. Engels also made a detailed segmentation of the text. The original manuscript was divided into only 7 chapters with few or no subdivisions. And Engels turned the 7 chapters into 7 parts with 52 chapters and a number of subparagraphs. Many of the structure incisions, as well as most of the headings, were created by Engels. Marx's text consists of 34 headings and 5 construction points, which are only numbered while Engels' edition contains 92 headings. The arrangement of a text and the headings used obviously strongly influence the understanding of a text, especially if the text is not finished, but in large part sketchy and incomplete. By putting this material together into chapters and inserting headings, this draft character is concealed. But even more important, the readers can no longer tell at what point in the manuscript presentation turns into inquiry. The difference between presentation and inquiry, however, is of central importance for Marx's own methodological understanding. To Marx, presentation does not mean the more or less skillful assembly of final results. The factual correlation of the conditions presented should be expressed by the correct presentation of the categories, by advancing from the abstract to the concrete. To Marx, the search for an adequate presentation is an essential part of his process of inquiry. But the difference between complete and incomplete presentation is concealed by the structure imposed by Engels. Additionally, Engels tried to strengthen the coherence of the text through omissions and connecting phrases. The readers do not learn that a large part of Marx's manuscript is open and undecided. Engels gives them a possible solution of the problems without letting them know that there is a problem. The solution given by Engels appears as a mostly complete elaboration by Marx. B. Textual transpositions. Engels transposed a large number of pieces of Marx's text. The transposed pieces consist of parts of a sentence, long paragraphs, and the rearrangement of whole text complexes, as in the 5th chapter, that is part 5, in Engels' edition. At this stage, a serious error of Engels has to be mentioned. Marx wanted to begin his 7th chapter, that is revenues or income and their sources, with number 1, the Trinity formula. Engels believed that he'd found 3 independent fragments concerning this point, 2 smaller ones which he had labeled 1 and 2, and a longer one labeled 3. This last fragment also had a gap which Engels pointed out to the readers. As Larissa Miskovich and Vitaly Vygotsky managed to show after an exact analysis of the manuscript, even before the MEGA volume was published, these are not 3 independent fragments. The fragments labeled 1 and 2 by Engels form a continuous text, which exactly fills the gap in fragment 3. C. Text omissions. Engels made a number of deletions of single words or parts of sentences and of whole paragraphs in longer text passages. Only some of these passages were repetitions. Sometimes they were substantially important statements, as, for example, the reflections on the transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2. D. Text conversions. Engels changed the relevance of many text passages. Footnotes were integrated into the main text. Many brackets in the main text were omitted. Most of Marx's emphases were deleted, and Engels introduced his own emphases in some places. The omission of brackets is especially problematic. It's not always clear whether the text in brackets is an addition to the current argumentation or a remark that should not at all be inserted at this point, or whether it is a preliminary, incomplete reflection. But such differentiations disappear in Engels' presentation. For instance, the famous passage on the poverty of the masses as the ultimate reason for all real crisis, which is often quoted as a proof for the existence of an underconsumption theory in Marx's work rather than overproduction, happened to be inside such a bracket and was integrated into the main text by Engels. Furthermore, Engels changed the text linguistically, but these merely stylistic transformations fluently became important alterations in context. For example, the replacement of mode of production by production. Not a trivial point. E. Insertions and textual extensions. Engels made a large number of insertions other than the ones he indicated with his initials. They concern single words or parts of a sentence or connecting phrases or explanations to the text. Even relativizations of and reservations to Marx's text can be found. The alteration of Marx's methodological remarks is especially critical to the understanding of the text, as we will see below. F. Modifications of minor importance. These consist of textual condensations. Engels summarized some passages expressed in a complicated way by Marx. Terminological alterations, stylistic changes in a narrow sense, for example, replacement of anglicisms, alteration, replacement, and deletion of mathematical examples, and correction of references and citations and their translation. This overview already shows that the 1894 edition was an extensive adaptation of Marx's manuscript, and Engels did not inform the readers about the true extent of his adaptation. The fact that this adaptation affected the meaning of the original text was outlined above. This shall now be shown in even more detail. Section 3, interpretatory handicaps caused by Engels' edition. A, crisis theory. Marx did not structure the third chapter of his manuscript, which deals with the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Engels divided the corresponding part of his edition into 3 chapters, that is, chapters 13 to 15. The first 2 chapters follow Marx's argumentation, which is adequately elaborated in the original. Later, Marx's chapter passes into a large mass of remarks, additions, and argumentative approaches in unelaborated and incomplete form. At this point, Marx's presentation is no longer a systematic one. Due to Engels giving this material a problematic chapter heading, that is, exposition of the internal contradictions of the law, introducing additional substructure, inserting headings, and increasing the coherence of the text by deleting paragraphs and omitting brackets, the material in the original manuscript is considerably upgraded. And indeed, this chapter 15, created by Engels, has often been considered a vastly complete crisis theory based on the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. So, an entire decades of interpretation could be misled, even though the text published by Engels still shows that Marx did not leave a complete crisis theory. The impression is given that Marx left an essentially complete framework that only had to be filled out. So, there's a lot of ink spilled subsequently. It is not even clear whether the material adapted by Engels was actually to constitute an independent paragraph. Several options were possible for later elaboration. Marx could have tried to turn this material into an independent chapter in direct relation to the presentation of the law of the falling tendency of the rate of profit. He could have tried to formulate an independent paragraph on capitalist crises, integrating further material from the sphere of the credit system, for instance. He could have also distributed the presentation of the various crisis phenomena mentioned into different chapters, avoiding an autonomous crisis theory, because that's kind of where it wound up. Or perhaps he would not have wanted to use a large part of what he had written about crisis within the 3 volumes of Capital. For each of these options, reasons could be given. With each option, crisis theory would obtain a different meaning. Engels not only avoided showing that there is a possible range of interpretations, he also directly interfered with Marx's text whenever it contradicted the interpretation he himself favored. For instance, Marx wrote on the overproduction of capital, which Engels calls overaccumulation of capital at this point. The closer analysis of this issue belongs to the study of the appearing movement of capital, where interest-bearing capital, etc., credit will be presented. And one must agree, credit, etc., Einwickelt, must agree with the editors of the Miga volume, who argue in the annotations that Erscheinende Bewegung des Kapitals, appearing movement of capital, does not belong to the matters dealt with in Capital. Engels, however, turned Marx's remark into the opposite. He omitted Marx's text and wrote instead, its closer analysis follows later. Now, in fact, some remarks on overproduction or overaccumulation of capital actually do follow. The fact that Marx obviously did not attach a systematic relevance to them at this point, because he thought the subject cannot be negotiated on the given level of abstraction, was turned into the opposite by Engels' textual alteration. B, credit theory. A similar situation arises in the 5th chapter of Marx's original manuscript. Here, at least, Engels gave an idea in the preface of the extent of the transpositions he'd made. In this chapter, too, Marx's presentation soon changed into the protocol of a research process containing a large amount of not fully accomplished reflections. By Engels' editing, the impression is again given that the elementary problems have been solved to a vast extent, and that it is merely a question of a not quite completed presentation. While the original structure of the 3rd chapter still remained visible after Engels' editing, the emphasis in the 5th chapter was completely shifted. As Marx's text shows, the topic of this chapter was to be interest-bearing capital. Marx divided this chapter into 6 subchapters. The first 4 points correspond to the first 4 chapters of Part 5 in the Engels edition, that is, chapters 21 to 24 in Capital Volume 3. Marx titled Point 5, Credit, Fictitious, Capital. Engels composed his chapters 25 to 35 from this material. Now, in doing this, he made many textual rearrangements, put footnotes into the text, distributed a whole chapter, the confusion, called the confusion, introduced a fair number of transitional remarks, and thus obscured the passages where Marx's text was no longer in a mature presentation, but a process of inquiry, or sometimes even just an excerpt. Thus, Marx's point 6, that is, pre-capitalist relationships, corresponds to the last chapter of Part 5 in Engels' edition. The structure, which in Marx's writing also indicates the systematic importance of the topic being treated, lists credit as the last systematic subpoint in the presentation of interest-bearing capital. Engels designs 11 chapters from this 5th point, not just because of its size, but also owing to the structuring of the material. The impression arises that the presentation of interest-bearing capital is just an introduction to the discussion of credit. This also prevails in the terminology. Part 5 is also often called the part on credit, even though credit is not even mentioned in the title. In this chapter, Engels also made textual changes as soon as the original text got in the way of his own interpretation. Marx introduced the point 5, credit, fictitious, capital, with the following sentence: an analysis of the credit system and of the instruments which it creates for its own use, like credit money, lies beyond our plan. Engels introduced the word exhaustive here. An exhaustive analysis of the credit system and of the instruments which it creates for its own use, credit money, etc., lies beyond our plan. He had made a similar alteration earlier on. In the first chapter of Marx's manuscript, the following remark follows under the subtitle Appreciation, Depreciation, Release, and Tie-up of Capital. The phenomena analyzed in this section require for their full development the credit system and competition on the world market. These more definitive forms of capitalist production can, 1, only be presented, however, after the general nature of capital is understood, and number 2, they do not come within the scope of this work and belong to its eventual continuation. Engels introduced the word comprehensively into the second sentence. These more definitive forms of capitalist production can only be comprehensively presented. Therefore, while Marx repeatedly declares that the presentation of the credit system lies beyond his plan, this statement is crucially relativized in the passages cited. As a consequence of these insertions, the consequent qualitative distinction between what on the level of presentation attained and what cannot is obstructed and reduced to mere quantitative problem. A comprehensive, exhaustive presentation which lies beyond the plan is confronted with the available less comprehensive presentation. Thus, Engels can include into the corpus of capital all sorts of points mentioned by Marx, although these cannot yet be presented systematically on the level of abstraction obtained. It would seem that to Engels, this appeared to be an unproblematic completion. The dialectically structured presentation, which was Marx's aim, in which the right sequence of terms and categories is crucial for the understanding of its meaning, is shifted towards a mere encyclopedic collection by Engels' edition. These differentiations are not mere hair splitting, as can be shown in the case of his credit theory, of the credit theory. For Marx's concept of presentation, the central question is whether the inherent laws regulating credit can actually be discussed on the highly abstract level of capital, or whether they are linked to a number of historically specific institutional factors, such as the constitution of the money and banking system, so that there cannot be a general credit theory. In Marx's manuscript, this question remains open. Engels chose to present the research materials found in Marx's manuscript on the general level, which led to the reproach against Marx that he had unduly generalized specific historic conditions of the credit system in 19th century England. Section C, commodity production and capitalist production. Engels attained a considerable influence over the interpretation of capital. As a result of his chapter law of value, and rate of profit in the supplement to Volume 3. There he claimed the existence of simple commodity production for several millennia before the emergence of capitalist commodity production, in which commodities were exchanged according to the labor time necessary for production. He cites an incidental remark made by Marx to prove that this was also Marx's opinion. Quote, "It is quite appropriate to regard the values of commodities as not only theoretically, but also historically prior to the prices of production." Unquote. Now, it may be a question for economic historians whether such a quote-unquote simple commodity production ever existed or not, but Engels' conclusion from this claim is meaningful for the interpretation of Capital. The first part of the first volume of Capital is seen as presenting the laws of this pre-capitalist commodity production. Engels thus fostered a historical reading of Capital, which could already be found in Kautsky's 1887 widespread popularization of Capital. Commodity and money, as they are presented at the beginning of the first volume of Capital, are thus turned into categories of pre-capitalist conditions, and the theoretical problem of the transformation of values into production prices is turned into a historical succession. However, as the introduction of 1857 shows with an example of the term labor, Marx was aware of the problem that seemingly simple categories mean different things in different production relations. As Marx already explains in the first sentence of Capital, he's not analyzing the commodity of a pre-capitalist simple commodity production. Rather, he is analyzing the commodity of a the commodity as an elementary form of the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, negating the pre-capitalist business. With similar clarity, Marx states in reviewing his argument in the last chapter of his manuscript, in the case of the simplest categories of the capitalist mode of production, in the case of commodities and money, we've already pointed out the mystifying character. Engels, however, underlays this statement with his own understanding of what is presented at the beginning of Capital and turns this sentence into, quote, "In the case of the simplest categories of the capitalist mode of production and even of commodity production, in the cases of commodities and money, we have already pointed out the mystifying character." Now, commodities and money are no longer the simplest categories of the capitalist mode of production, but of commodity production. This is an important difference, actually. Conclusions. Number 4, the book published by Engels in 1894 is not a mere edition of Marx's manuscript, but a far-reaching adaptation of the original manuscript. Only the smallest number of Engels' interventions is made visible. The largest extent of the alterations remains hidden to the readers. The interventions themselves are not just of a formal or stylistic nature. They deceive the readers about the actual extent of elaboration. They offer solutions for problems which the manuscript left open without clarification that these are Engels' solutions. And in some passages, they even change the argumentation of the original text if this obstructs Engels' interpretation. Therefore, Engels' edition can no longer be considered to be volume 3 of Marx's Capital. It is not Marx's text in the full genuineness of his own presentation, as Engels wrote in the supplement, but a strong editing of this presentation, a pre-interpreted textbook edition of Marx's manuscript. The fact that Engels did not undertake a textual editing fulfilling modern demands is quite understandable from the point of view of those times. Editions did not have to fulfill such high demands concerning textual loyalty as is necessary today. An editor was given much larger freedom than today, especially if it was spiritually close to the edited author. Furthermore, it was most important to Engels to publish a book which could serve as an intellectual weapon for the working class in the class struggle, which therefore was understandable and topical. And with all the criticisms in view, we must not forget that it was an incredible achievement to publish this manuscript, of which Marx had once said in a letter to Engels that nobody at all could publish it in a readable form except for he himself. Even still, all understanding for Engels' motives and procedure cannot alter the assessment that the text he has presented is by no means the third volume of Capital. Every future discussion of Marx's economic theory will have to refer to Marx's original manuscript. But this manuscript cannot simply be considered to be the third volume of Capital, judging from the full elaboration of the first volume. Therefore, it is indeed a first incomplete draft, as Engels says in the preface. The gaps, however, are not just of a quantitative nature. It is not just that Marx didn't have enough time to fully accomplish an already complete sketched picture. Quite a few places, it is not even clear what the sketches should look like on the given basis. Lots of things under erasure. Marx was nowhere near solving all of the conceptual problems. Even the fully developed parts of his work, such as the value and money theory of the first volume, including a number of ambivalences, which make it seem questionable whether it was in any way possible to complete Capital on the given basis. So, yes, I'm sorry I went on there, but this is Michael Heinrich's conclusion, and in some ways it serves his purpose relative to translating and introducing volumes 1, 2, and 3, as well as providing an introduction to volume 1, which is, with all due respect, a kind of historiographic revision, but that's for another time. So that's kind of important. So in looking at the introduction to this, the critical analogy on volume 3 by multiple authors, Campbell et al., and Michael Heinrich's own little article here from 1996, we see that there's a certain indeterminacy and incompleteness, a sense of lacking that might be there in terms of designating any collected version that claims to be volume 3 of Capital. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't read it, but that you have to remind yourself that this is Engels writing, interpreting Marx's manuscripts, and is not a quote-unquote authentic rendering, if there could be one, of volume 3. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't read it, look at it, because it does cover a significant number of topics that Marx, yes, promised to look at from the earlier volumes. So that makes it an important piece of attention. And I think if Higginbottom does present, Andy Higginbottom presents his lecture series on volume 3, it's a question that we might want to ask in discussion. And there's, yes, considerable notes here. And a question raised, this is from EndNote 1. The manuscript for Book 3, which was written in 1864-5, was used by Engels as a basis for his edition of the third volume in 1894. For the second volume of Capital, which he published, he did not use the corresponding manuscript of 1864, but later texts. To what extent, and this is an important point, to what extent the 3 volumes of Capital still follow the original plan of 6 books is a disputed issue. And Rudolsky brings this up, as and of course Heinrich. And this is not to make it totally unsolvable. It just means that, we have lots of contingencies. And so I've included on this particular page, posting, the internet version of Engels' Capital Volume 3 preface, and I'm not going to read it. You can read it yourself, but it does, Engels, it's not like Engels was trying to hide stuff. He just wanted to address all these kinds of questions and give you a little bit of sense of what he was doing. On the other hand, by the time it emerges at the end, and whether you're going to blame Engels or Kautsky, there's all kinds of folks that you can get mad at, etc. And noting, of course, that that big digression into that has been created historically into crisis theory, etc. Also quite important to note. And so I've included the preface, and I think I've included chapter 1 as well. But anyway, that's that. Unfortunately, I'm going to look at landscape pictures. Stop the